At 6:18 on a gray morning in the summer of 1943, on the edge of a shattered French village, one lone Sherman tank sat hidden behind a low rise as 16 German Panthers rolled forward across open ground. 16 of the deadliest tanks in Europe, advancing in perfect formation. Inside the Sherman, a four-man crew waited in silence, knowing they were outnumbered beyond reason. What happened next defied every rule of armored warfare. If stories like this matter to you, hit like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. By the summer of 1943, the balance of armored power in Europe leaned heavily in Germany's favor wherever Panthers appeared. The Allies were advancing on multiple fronts, but every breakthrough came at brutal cost. In southern Europe and along newly contested corridors, German armored units were being rushed to plug gaps in collapsing lines. And when the Panthers arrived, they did not come to stall, they came to annihilate. The Panther was no longer an experimental machine. By 1943, it had matured into the most feared medium tank on the battlefield. Designed in direct response to the Soviet T-34, it combined sloped frontal armor with a high-velocity 75mm gun capable of killing most Allied armor at distances far beyond return fire. German doctrine used Panthers aggressively, long-range gunnery, rapid maneuvers, and coordinated formations that exploited Allied weaknesses with mathematical cruelty. Allied tank crews knew the reputation well. In report after report, the verdict was the same: standard Shermans could not reliably kill Panthers from the front. At anything beyond close range, Allied rounds shattered uselessly against sloped German armor. Crews were forced to rely on desperate flanking shots, artillery support, or airstrikes, if any of those were available. Often, they were not. In the weeks leading up to this engagement in 1943, Allied armored units in the region had been bleeding. Platoons were reduced to scattered survivors. Tank after tank burned in open fields where retreat was impossible. German counterattacks followed a pattern: probe with reconnaissance, fix Allied armor in place with long-range fire, then apply crushing force with concentrated Panther groups. Once pinned, Shermans rarely escaped. German confidence was not arrogance, it was calculation. Veteran Panzer crews from the Eastern Front now fought in Western and Southern Europe. These men had destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks in Ukraine and Kursk. They were disciplined, experienced, and patient. When Panthers advanced, they did so under orders that assumed superiority as a fact, not a possibility. 16 Panthers moving together in 1943 was not a demonstration, it was an execution detail. Against such formations, Allied doctrine offered grim advice: avoid frontal engagement at all costs, call for air or artillery, and disengage if possible. But disengagement was often a luxury that battlefield geography simply did not allow. Villages, hedgerows, narrow roads, and broken terrain trapped tanks into fire corridors where Panthers could kill at will. For infantry on the ground, the sight of Panthers advancing meant something even worse. These tanks did not merely defeat armored units, they erased defensive positions. A single Panther platoon could dismantle a rifle company in minutes once supporting Shermans were destroyed. German armor was not just a tactical problem, it shaped entire sectors of the front. By mid-1943, Allied losses in previous armored clashes across this region had reached levels that commanders quietly labeled unsustainable. Replacement crews arrived with minimal combat experience. Many had never fired their guns in anger. They faced enemies who had survived years of tank warfare across two continents. The psychology of the battlefield changed when Panthers appeared. Radios filled with clipped, controlled fear. Infantry dug deeper. Tank commanders scanned for withdrawal routes almost by instinct. Everyone understood the numbers. Everyone understood the outcome that usually followed. And now, on this morning in 1943, 16 Panthers were advancing again. They moved deliberately, not rushing. The distance across the open ground favored German gunnery. At long range, Panthers were hunters. At close range, they were executioners. Either way, any lone Sherman caught in their path faced extinction measured in seconds. There was no Allied tank formation waiting to meet them. No massed armor poised for a countercharge. No artillery barrage roaring down protection in advance. What stood in their path was a single isolated Sherman, hidden in concealment so thin it could barely be called cover at all. From a strategic perspective, the outcome should already have been written. 16 Panthers versus 1 Sherman in 1943 was not a battle, it was a prediction. German doctrine expected to destroy such a target with clinical efficiency. 2 Panthers would fix it in place. Others would maneuver for flanking fire. Remaining tanks would suppress any infantry attempting to support it. Within moments, the Sherman would be burning wreckage, just another statistic in the day's victory report. That was how every previous encounter had ended. The Allied command had no illusions. They understood the imbalance of armor, firepower, and crew experience. Reports had already warned that even bold action rarely stopped massed Panther assaults without overwhelming support. Courage alone did not defeat sloped steel and high-velocity shells. Yet, despite everything doctrine predicted, despite every precedent written in smoke and twisted metal across the battlefields of 1943, on this morning, the rules were about to be tested in a way German tank commanders did not expect. Because hidden behind that low rise was not simply a Sherman waiting to die. It was a crew about to attempt something that no field manual, no training exercise, and no previous engagement had prepared the battlefield to witness. The Allied armies did not face the Panther crisis blindly. Long before 16 German tanks began rolling across that open field in 1943, the problem had already been recognized in quiet reports sent up the chain of command. Field officers, tank commanders, and intelligence analysts all repeated the same conclusion in different words: standard Allied tank firepower was no longer keeping pace with German armor. Yet recognizing a problem and solving it in wartime are two very different things. At the heart of the issue was a hard mechanical truth. The guns carried by most Allied Shermans in early and mid-1943 were designed for flexibility, infantry support, light armor engagement, general battlefield utility. They were never intended to duel the newest generation of German tanks at long range. Against Panthers, their rounds often shattered or deflected unless fired from ideal angles at dangerously close distances. Engineers proposed solutions immediately. Bigger guns. Higher velocity ammunition. Even entirely new turret designs. On paper, many of these ideas promised salvation. In reality, they collided head-on with the limits of production, shipping capacity, training time, and bureaucratic caution. Some proposals were dismissed as too disruptive to existing manufacturing lines. Others demanded materials already in short supply. A few were labeled outright dangerous, ideas that could theoretically work but might damage the tank itself or exhaust crews beyond safe limits. One concept in particular lingered on the edge of official approval for months. It involved equipping a small number of Shermans with a weapon normally considered excessive for such a platform, a high-velocity anti-armor gun intended to defeat the Panther at range rather than outmaneuver it at close quarters. The idea unsettled administrators. The Sherman's turret was not designed to house such a weapon comfortably. Recoil forces were severe. Space for ammunition became dangerously tight. Crew workflow would be compromised. Nothing about it fit neatly into standard doctrine. And yet, field pressure kept the proposal alive. Combat reports from 1943 arrived faster than committees could ignore them. Each new engagement with Panther units reinforced the same truth: without a way to kill German armor head-on, Allied tank crews would continue dying in battles where courage and maneuver meant little against superior steel. An experimental program was authorized quietly, not as a major doctrinal shift, but as a contingency. Rather than re-equipping every tank, only a handful would receive this new capability. They would operate as specialists embedded within larger formations, reserved specifically for anti-armor emergencies. Training was rushed and uneven. Crews selected for these modified Shermans were often pulled from standard units with minimal warning. Many were already combat veterans. Few had handled such a weapon before. They were taught its operation with urgency rather than comfort. The weapon itself introduced new problems. Its recoil was violent enough to rock the entire tank. The muzzle flash was blinding at close range and visible for miles in open terrain. Ammunition was heavier, bulkier, and far more exhausting to handle under pressure. Every shot demanded physical strain and absolute concentration. On the test range, the results were promising. At controlled distances, the gun could penetrate Panther armor where normal Sherman rounds failed completely. Steel that once deflected incoming fire now ruptured under impact. But test ranges do not shoot back. In open combat, success would depend on far more than raw penetration power. The crew would have to survive long enough to use it. And German tank commanders were not fools. Any abnormal silhouette on the battlefield quickly drew attention. Tanks carrying visibly longer barrels or behaving differently became immediate priority targets. As 1943 wore on, only a limited number of these specialized Shermans made it to the front. Too few to shift the balance of a campaign. Barely enough to influence isolated engagements. In most sectors, Panther dominance continued unchecked. Yet within command circles, quiet hope grew. The concept had worked, at least technically. The question was no longer whether Panthers could be destroyed from the front, but whether a single tank and crew could survive long enough to attempt it under real battlefield conditions. By the time the engagement of 16 Panthers approached, one such Sherman had already been operating intermittently in the sector. Its presence was known to only a few officers. Its missions were chosen carefully. Its crew had fired the new weapon in combat only a handful of times. They were not legends. They were not celebrated specialists. They were simply men assigned to a machine that was never meant to fight alone. And now, against overwhelming odds, that quiet experimental capability was about to be tested not in controlled conditions, not with supporting armor, and not with a margin for error, but in the most extreme trial of massed German armor a single Sherman crew could ever face. Whatever doubts had surrounded the weapon's design, reliability, and practicality would be answered in the only courtroom that mattered in wartime: the battlefield itself. Inside the Sherman that waited behind the low rise were 4 men who, on paper, should never have been matched against 16 Panthers. They were not elite tank aces pulled from propaganda reels. They were ordinary soldiers carrying the accumulated fatigue of war into one extraordinary moment. The commander was Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer, 30 years old, a former auto mechanic from Ohio who had entered the Army in 1941. He had survived North Africa and Sicily, not by bold heroics but by disciplined caution. Mercer believed survival in armored warfare came from patience measured in seconds and inches. He had lost 2 previous tanks to German fire. Each time, he watched friends die and learned again how thin steel really was. To his right sat Corporal Thomas Reed, the gunner. Reed was only 23. Before the war he worked in a machine shop, shaping steel with steady hands and quiet focus. That skill translated naturally into gunnery. He understood angles instinctively, felt distance through vibration, and trusted numbers more than noise. Yet despite his talent, Reed had never faced a Panther in a direct duel. His previous kills were against lighter German vehicles, half-tracks and early Panzer models that did not require perfect placement to defeat. Behind them crouched Private First Class Samuel Ortiz, the loader. 21, from New Mexico, broad-shouldered and tireless in training, Ortiz carried the most physically punishing role in the tank. The ammunition for their new gun was brutally heavy. Each shell demanded full-body effort under conditions of heat, smoke, and concussion. In combat, loaders often collapsed from exhaustion without ever being wounded. Ortiz had loaded in live fire twice before. Never under sustained pressure. In the hull sat the driver, Corporal Edward "Eddie" Walsh, a farm boy from Iowa who measured terrain like soil and slope rather than through military jargon. He felt the ground through the tank's suspension, listening for changes in traction the way a farmer listens to an engine under load. Walsh had an uncanny instinct for backing through chaos without losing orientation, an almost invisible skill that often meant the difference between survival and fiery impact. 4 men. 1 tank. Against 16. The Sherman itself was a contradiction of reputation and reality. To the public, it was often portrayed as the symbol of Allied armored power, fast, reliable, everywhere. To those who fought inside it, the Sherman was something far more complicated, dependable in its mechanics, unforgiving in its protection. Its armor was thin compared to the Panther, designed for mobility and mass production rather than head-on tank duels. A Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate the Sherman from well beyond 1,000 meters. At most frontal angles, the Sherman's chance of survival against such fire was measured in milliseconds of luck. And yet this particular Sherman carried the experimental capability that commanders quietly called their only real answer to the Panther. Its main gun was a high-velocity anti-armor weapon crammed into a turret originally designed for a more forgiving role. The shells were longer, heavier, and far more powerful. Fired correctly, they could pierce German frontal armor at ranges that standard Sherman guns could only dream of achieving. But power came with cost. The gun's recoil slammed through the entire tank structure. Each shot staggered the chassis like a physical blow. The muzzle flash was blinding even in daylight, bright enough to leave brief blindness in the crew and to betray the firing position instantly to every enemy observer within sight. The penetrating ability that made the weapon valuable also made the tank visible, predictable, and hunted. Ammunition storage had been reduced to make room for the larger shells. There were fewer rounds to spare. Every shot now carried weight not only in steel but in consequence. Misses could not be afforded. Panic could not be afforded. Hesitation could not be afforded. Across the field, the Panther tanks represented the opposite philosophy of warfare. They were heavy, imposing machines built specifically to dominate other tanks. Their frontal armor was sloped at severe angles that magnified actual thickness into near immunity at long range. Their main gun fired with extraordinary velocity and accuracy. German crews trusted it absolutely. On favorable terrain, Panthers did not feel threatened, they felt inevitable. The technical imbalance was overwhelming. On paper, the Panther outmatched the Sherman in armor thickness, firepower consistency, survivability, and intimidation. German crews trained to engage at distances where return fire was ineffective. They fired first, hit first, and usually ended the encounter before the enemy could adapt. The only area where the Sherman held an advantage, if it could be called that, was reliability and ease of maintenance. The Panther was powerful but mechanically temperamental. Transmission failures, fuel strain, and suspension breakdowns were common under prolonged stress. The Sherman, relatively underpowered, often kept running when others failed. But mechanical reliability meant little in a duel measured in seconds. For Mercer and his crew, the knowledge of these technical realities pressed constantly against their thoughts as the ground trembled under 16 advancing Panthers. The men understood the physics of their situation. They knew exactly what German shells could do to their armor. They had seen it done to others. They also knew that their own gun, if used perfectly, could change the equation. The problem was that battlefield perfection is a fantasy. Dust, recoil, smoke, vibration, enemy movement, and fear all distort precision. A round that misses by inches might glance harmlessly off angled armor. A second of delay might allow a Panther to fire first. An overlooked flanking threat could end everything without warning. Mercer steadied his voice inside the turret. He spoke in short, controlled sentences. No speeches. No dramatics. Calm was a weapon in itself. He reminded his crew today would not be decided by speed but by discipline. Reed adjusted his sight quietly, mapping mental reference points across the field: burned trees, a stone fence partially collapsed, a low ridge that broke the horizon. Every landmark became a potential firing solution. Ortiz placed his hands on the next round, feeling its weight even before he lifted it. He understood what 15 seconds of sustained loading would demand from his body. Walsh kept the engine at a low, controlled idle, ready to move the moment Mercer gave the word. None of them spoke of retreat. The terrain behind them offered little protection. Turning their back to 16 Panthers would likely draw immediate pursuit and fatal rear fire. Their best chance of survival lay in stillness, calculation, and using the one advantage they possessed with absolute precision. As the Panthers closed from the distant haze into defined silhouettes, the scale of the threat became unmistakable. The ground itself seemed occupied by enemy steel. One tank was terrifying. 4 were disastrous. 16 were beyond any scenario Allied training manuals could realistically prepare for. And yet this was no drill. No maneuver. No calculated exercise. This was the battlefield choosing its conditions. Whatever happened next would be decided not by numbers, not by doctrine, but by 4 men inside a thin shell of steel and the violent mathematics of a single experimental gun. The Panthers advanced in disciplined silence, their movement so steady it felt mechanical rather than human. From behind the low rise, Mercer watched their formation tighten as they crossed the last open stretch of ground. They were no longer scattered silhouettes in the distance. Now they were distinct machines, dark, angular shapes moving with deliberate intent. Dust lifted behind their tracks in long pale banners that hung in the air like warning flags. Range? Mercer asked. 700 and closing, Reed replied, voice level. They're spreading into 3 elements. Mercer saw it too. 6 Panthers held the center, forming the hammer. 5 peeled slightly to the right, 5 to the left, classic encirclement geometry. German doctrine was unfolding exactly as the manuals described. Fix the target. Flank the target. Crush the target. They still hadn't fired. They didn't need to, not yet. At this distance, their guns could already kill, but German commanders preferred certainty. They would close the range, tighten the angles, eliminate escape routes, and then fire with overwhelming confidence. It was systematic. It was patient. And it was deadly. The Sherman remained motionless. Mercer knew the most dangerous moment of any ambush was the waiting. Anticipation invited panic. Panic invited mistakes. He forced his breathing slow and kept his eyes moving across the field, tracking threat lines and escape corridors that barely existed. Hold fire, he said quietly. Not yet. 400 meters to the center element meant death for standard Shermans. For their gun, it meant possibility, but only if everything went right. 650. 600. The Panthers' commanders were now visible in their turrets, scanning for contact. They did not yet see the Sherman's low silhouette behind the rise. The terrain folded just enough to conceal it. Reed adjusted the elevation wheel in half-turn movements, tracking the lead tank in the center formation. He did not look at the others. He chose his first target with deliberate restraint, a tank slightly ahead of the formation, its angled armor confidently exposed. 550, he murmured. Mercer calculated the time window. Once the first gun fired, their position would be revealed instantly. Smoke. Flash. Noise. The German response would be immediate and coordinated. They might survive the first shot. The second would decide whether they lived at all. Ortiz braced his legs behind the gun, already sweating before the work truly began. Walsh's foot hovered lightly on the clutch, engine vibrating with controlled restraint. "Fire," Mercer said. The recoil struck like a physical blow to the chest. The gun's thunder filled the turret completely, erasing all thought for a fraction of a second. A blinding flash tore across the field. The Sherman lurched backward against its suspension as if shoved by an invisible hand. Reed blinked through the afterimage, forcing his eye back into the sight. The round crossed the ground in less than a second. The first Panther died without warning. The shell struck the frontal plate at a vulnerable angle just below the turret ring, where steel geometry betrayed even German design. The penetration was surgical. For a fraction of a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then smoke burst from the tank's commander hatch in a dense black plume. The Panther rolled forward another few meters, slowed, and stopped. No explosion. No fireball. Just sudden stillness. 16 had become 15. The German response was instantaneous. Panthers scattered with practiced precision. The center element broke apart. 2 veered hard left. 3 accelerated right. Flanking groups pushed wider. Radios crackled in German turrets now lit with urgency. The terrain that had concealed the Sherman now betrayed it. Smoke marked the firing point like an accusation. "Reload!" Mercer snapped. Ortiz was already moving. The spent casing fell away with heavy clatter. He lifted the next shell with both arms, muscles straining as he guided it into the breach. Sweat ran into his eyes as he slammed the mechanism shut. Up! Reed swung the gun toward a Panther racing to the right, its side armor briefly exposed as it pivoted to reduce profile. German commanders were disciplined, but even discipline could not reverse physics. Turning a 45-ton tank created vulnerable moments. Reed led the target instinctively. The sight picture settled in a brief pocket of calm amid chaos. Fire! The second shot was cleaner. The shell struck the Panther at the rear of its side plate near the suspension housing. The penetration detonated internal ammunition. The result was not subtle. The turret lifted violently, thrown upward by internal explosion, then landed inverted several meters away in a cloud of fire and debris. 14. The sound of German return fire cut through the smoke like tearing steel. 3 75mm rounds hit almost simultaneously. One exploded short of the Sherman's position in the dirt. Another shattered against the top of the rise, hurling fragments of stone across the tank's hull. The third screamed overhead close enough that Mercer felt the pressure wave slap the turret. They were ranging in. "Move back, now!" Mercer ordered. Walsh threw the Sherman into reverse. The tank lurched backward down the far side of the rise as Ortiz fought to brace himself against the interior while lifting another shell. German rounds chewed into the earth where they had stood seconds earlier. The Sherman slid into a shallow fold of ground only partially shielded by scattered debris from a collapsed farm structure. It was not good cover. It was simply less exposed than before. "Contact left," Reed called. 2 Panthers pushed hard from the left flank, attempting to close the distance rapidly while the right side element continued suppressive fire. German doctrine again, pressure from multiple vectors to force target paralysis. Reed chose the nearer left Panther as it crested a small depression at full speed. Range 450. Mercer felt his own pulse now, steady but louder than before. Every second accelerated the engagement beyond theory and into inevitability. Fire. The third round struck low. It punched through the lower frontal plate and exploded inside the transmission housing. The Panther lurched violently, tracks locking. The tank skidded sideways and stopped in a violent arc of torn metal. Its turret still traversed, but the hull was dead. 13. German fire intensified immediately. Suppression was now deliberate and accurate. Shells smashed into the debris field around the Sherman, collapsing what little protection remained. A wooden support beam from the ruined structure exploded into splinters under impact. Smoke, dust, and burning fragments filled the air. Their concealment was gone. "Ammo!" Mercer demanded. Ortiz forced another shell into place. His breathing had turned harsh and short. Each round weighed like punishment. 6 AP remaining, he replied. Mercer absorbed the number. The fight was far from over. On the right, a Panther attempted a wide flanking maneuver, cutting toward a shallow draw that would allow it to emerge behind the Sherman's position. Reed traversed desperately, chasing the moving silhouette through drifting smoke. German fire struck the Sherman's rear slope with a deafening clang. The armor held, but the impact drove shrapnel fragments from the interior lining. Walsh shouted something from the hull, but his voice was lost in the thunder. "Fire!" Mercer ordered. The fourth round slammed into the flanking Panther just as it crossed the shallow draw. The shot entered through the side of the turret. A burst of flame erupted from the commander's hatch, followed by thick rolling smoke. 12. The battlefield no longer resembled an advance. It had become a killing ground. Panthers maneuvered aggressively now, abandoning elegant formation in favor of survival through dominance. Two pressed directly toward the Sherman through the center, firing on the move. Others continued to seek angles from both flanks. German commanders now understood exactly what kind of threat they faced, and they moved to eliminate it without hesitation. Mercer's tank shook under repeated near misses. Reed fought the sight picture through vibration and drifting rubble. Ortiz loaded on instinct now, body working without conscious permission. Walsh edged the Sherman forward and back by inches at Mercer's command, altering angles just enough to spoil German ranging solutions. Another hit blew a crater in the ground 2 meters in front of the hull. Dirt washed over the front plate like a wave. The next shell would not miss by such a margin. Reed fired again. The 5th Panther fell with a violent internal detonation that flipped the turret violently to one side. 11. But now the Sherman's position was fully compromised. Smoke hung heavy across the field. German guns tracked them with intent. The engagement had crossed the point of surprise and entered the phase of calculated mutual destruction. The math was no longer in their favor. They had drawn blood. They had shattered doctrine. But the Panthers were not retreating. They were closing. The battlefield tightened like a noose. Smoke drifted in uneven curtains across the ground, breaking sightlines and turning distance into guesswork. German gunners stopped firing blindly and began using the smoke as moving cover, advancing in short, precise surges. What had been a wide engagement zone seconds earlier collapsed into a deadly corridor of overlapping fire. Mercer felt the pressure shift immediately. This was no longer an ambush. This was a hunt. Ammunition, he said. Ortiz wiped his forearm across his face, smearing sweat and soot. 5 armor-piercing left. 1 sabot. The word sabot carried a different gravity inside the turret. That single round offered exceptional penetration, but demanded perfect placement. It was unforgiving of haste and inaccurate at longer distances. It was a weapon of last resort. Walsh reported from the hull, voice tight. Engine temperature spiking. We can still maneuver, but not for long at this pace. German shells slammed closer with frightening regularity now. One struck the ground so near the left track that the shock wave lifted the Sherman half an inch before it crashed back onto its suspension with a metallic groan. Another round tore through the debris behind them, sending fragments rattling across the turret roof. 2 Panthers pushed straight through the smoke on the centerline, advancing with relentless confidence. Their guns traversed smoothly, already bracketing the Sherman's last firing position. They're fixing us, Reed said. Flankers coming in from both sides. Mercer understood. The Germans were reasserting doctrine, pin the target in place, then kill it from multiple angles at once. They had sacrificed speed for certainty, and now they were prepared to pay in steel. Walsh, edge us right, 10 feet, Mercer ordered. Slow. The Sherman crept sideways, tracks biting into uneven earth. The motion shifted the firing angle just enough to distort German ranging solutions. A shell tore through the smoke and slammed into the vacated ground where they had stood seconds earlier. The blast showered the Sherman with fragments of stone and metal. Contact, left flank, 300 meters and closing. Reed called. A Panther burst from the smoke at speed, its side armor fully exposed for a fleeting heartbeat as it pivoted to bring its gun into alignment. Fire! The 6th shot struck true, punching through the side plate and erupting inside the fighting compartment. Flames blasted out of every open hatch as the tank died violently in motion. 10. But the victory lasted only an instant. From the right flank, a 2nd Panther fired almost simultaneously. The round smashed into the Sherman's front slope at a shallow angle. The armor held, but the impact drove the crew back against their restraints with bone-jarring force. Instruments flickered violently. The turret rang like a struck bell. Ortiz staggered but kept his footing. He forced another round into the breach with trembling arms. Reed's voice sharpened. We're down to long shots now. They're closing inside 300. German gunners were no longer content with ranged superiority. They wanted certainty through proximity. 1 Panther advanced straight on through drifting smoke, presenting its thickest frontal armor as though daring the Sherman to try. A 2nd Panther moved wide to the right, its commander attempting to create a crossing shot that would trap the Sherman between 2 lethal arcs. Mercer's choices narrowed to seconds. If they stayed, they would be bracketed and destroyed. If they moved, they risked exposing their thinner side armor to immediate fire. Walsh, Mercer said, voice steady, break left on my mark. Reed, take the right side Panther the moment it clears the smoke. Ortiz, sabot on deck. The Sherman's engine growled under renewed strain as Walsh prepared to move. German fire cracked again. A shell tore into the dirt directly in front of the hull and exploded upward in a geyser of earth that momentarily blinded Reed's sight. Mark! Mercer shouted. Walsh slammed the Sherman left. The tank lurched violently out of its shallow refuge, exposing its hull fully for the first time since the engagement began. German commanders reacted instantly, turrets snapping toward the sudden movement. Through thinning smoke, Reed glimpsed the right-side Panther at 280 meters, close enough now that angles became brutal and unforgiving. "Fire sabot." Ortiz slammed the sabot round into the breech and locked it. Reed fired without hesitation. The sabot dart struck the Panther's frontal plate with extraordinary velocity. For an instant, the armor appeared to resist. Then the penetrator punched through in a fountain of molten steel. The shell shredded the interior of the turret in a burst of white-hot fragments. The Panther's gun froze mid-traverse as smoke erupted violently from its commander's cupola. 9. But the left-side Panther had closed dangerously near during the maneuver. Its gun aligned with merciless calm. Mercer saw the muzzle begin to elevate through the open sight slit. "Reverse, hard," he shouted. Walsh threw the transmission into full reverse. The Sherman lurched backward violently as the Panther fired. The German shell tore through the air where the Sherman's turret had stood a heartbeat earlier. The round slammed into the ground behind them and detonated in a blinding blast that rolled the tank sideways with sheer concussion. The crew was thrown against the interior again. Sparks cascaded from the turret basket. The engine screamed in protest. Reed struggled back onto the site. The left-side Panther still filled his view, now broadside for a fleeting second as its gun recoiled from the near miss. Fire! The seventh shot was almost too fast to register. It struck the Panther just behind the driver's position, tearing through the thinner side armor and detonating internal fuel stores. The tank erupted in a boiling pillar of flame that engulfed it completely. 8. For the first time since the ambush began, the German advance hesitated. Surviving Panthers halted their forward rush. Commanders reassessed through drifting smoke, calculating again whether aggression still promised certainty. 8 Panthers operational remained, but now they faced a Sherman that had already done what German doctrine deemed statistically impossible. Mercer recognized the shift instantly. "We've broken their confidence," he said. "They'll go hull down and duel us." They were right. The remaining Panthers pulled back behind subtle rises in the terrain, exposing only their turrets while maintaining firing distance. German gunners settled into long-range posture again, determined to finish the fight through measured destruction rather than further costly aggression. Reed tracked the nearest visible turret at 350 meters. Only a narrow arc of steel cresting the earth offered any vulnerability at all. Ortiz whispered quietly now, muscles trembling under exhaustion. 3 rounds left. Walsh kept the engine barely above stall, conserving heat and fuel for a final move. German fire resumed in careful, methodical cadence. 1 round skimmed the Sherman's right flank and detonated beyond it. Another shattered the earth 3 meters short. Each shell came closer than the last. Mercer waited. He waited for the smallest error. Reed watched a Panther turret hesitate as its commander scanned through smoke. The German gun paused at the edge of its traverse limit for a fraction of a second longer than the others. "There," Reed said. Mercer did not hesitate. "Fire." The 8th round crossed the ground in less than half a second. It struck the turret face just off-center and punched through into the gun housing. The Panther's turret locked instantly. Smoke poured out in tight spirals. The tank slumped into immobility without explosion. 7. A heavy silence fell for a heartbeat across the field, broken only by the distant engine noise of surviving Panthers repositioning for a final attempt to close. Mercer exhaled slowly. "The next engagement decides everything," he said. They all knew it. The field had turned into a chessboard soaked with burning oil and shattered steel. And the last moves were approaching. When the firing finally slackened, the battlefield sounded unreal in its quiet. The crack of cannon and the shriek of steel faded into isolated secondary explosions as burning Panthers continued to cook off in scattered intervals. Black columns of smoke rose across the ground like signal flares, marking where German armor had fallen. For several long seconds, neither side moved. Mercer ordered Walsh to hold position. The remaining Panthers had withdrawn just beyond immediate firing angles, slipping back behind low contours in the terrain. They had not routed in panic, but they had ceded the field. Doctrine had been broken, not by superior numbers, but by unacceptable loss. Moments later, Allied infantry began pushing forward cautiously from their defensive positions. Riflemen advanced in short bounds, weapons raised, expecting at any moment that German machine gun fire might erupt from among the wrecks. It did not. The field belonged to them now. Mercer climbed partially from the turret, scanning through the smoke for movement. He counted again to be certain. 8 Panthers burned openly. Others sat disabled at strange angles, turrets skewed, tracks torn away. Of the 16 that had advanced, none remained capable of immediate combat. The few that had fallen back did so without firing again. The engagement had lasted less than a quarter of an hour. Within the hour, intelligence officers arrived under escort. They moved methodically among the wrecked German tanks, measuring penetration points, photographing impact angles, and recording strike locations on clipped maps. They collected shell fragments from inside destroyed turrets. They interviewed Mercer and Reed separately, noting times, distances, aiming points, and the sequence of fire. From the German tanks alone, analysts immediately confirmed what frontline commanders had only dared to hope. The modified Sherman had successfully defeated Panthers at multiple engagement angles, including frontal penetration, at ranges previously considered unworkable for Allied armor without artillery or air power. Radio traffic carried the news rapidly beyond the sector. Regimental headquarters requested full battle logs by nightfall. Within 24 hours, the engagement was circulating as a verified field report among multiple armored units. For Allied commanders struggling against German heavy armor throughout 1943, the implications were enormous. The Germans studied the battle as well. Reconnaissance teams reached the site within days of the engagement's conclusion. They examined their own wrecked machines and recorded the penetration patterns with equal care. German analysts concluded quickly that a new variable had entered the battlefield. The Sherman they had dismissed as inferior now represented a potential threat when fitted with its unknown capability. Orders began changing quietly. German tank commanders received updated instructions emphasizing immediate identification and elimination of modified Shermans before massed engagement. Panther formations were warned to shift opening fire distances and to rely more heavily on infantry spotting and crossfire coordination. What had once been confident superiority was now recalibrated into controlled caution. For the Allies, the opposite transformation was underway. The engagement validated months of experimental work that had previously been treated as contingency rather than doctrine. Requests for additional modified Shermans surged upward through logistical channels. Tank schools revised training syllabi to emphasize long-range gunnery discipline and hull-down ambush positioning. Engagement geometry that had once favored Panthers exclusively was now contested space. But the victory also carried a sobering underside. The intelligence report included frank analysis of the Sherman's vulnerabilities. The weapon's muzzle flash revealed firing positions instantly. The extreme recoil degraded crew endurance. Ammunition supply was limited. Sustainment under prolonged combat remained problematic. The modified Sherman was not a universal answer, it was a specialized tool demanding restraint, precision, and protection. Casualty officers counted German losses with precision. Allied losses from the engagement itself were minimal, but the wider campaign numbers remained brutal. For every confirmed armored victory, there were corresponding reports of Shermans lost under other circumstances across the front. Yet for the first time in months, the balance sheet against Panther units no longer appeared hopeless. Strategically, the engagement did not break a German front line. It did not trigger a sweeping counteroffensive. It did something more subtle, and arguably more important. It changed expectations. Commanders on both sides now understood that German heavy armor could no longer advance with absolute certainty under all conditions. Panthers remained deadly. They remained dominant in many situations. But they were no longer unchallengeable by Allied tanks alone. The field manuals were being rewritten in real time. Mercer and his crew remained on station through the night as engineers secured disabled German tanks for further examination. Infantry established perimeter defenses in case of counterattack. None came. German forces in the sector pulled back to reorganize rather than attempt additional frontal assaults under revised risk assumptions. By morning, the battlefield was transformed from a line of advance into a study ground of blackened steel and scorched earth. What had begun as a single isolated fight between a lone Sherman and a massed German formation had evolved into a data point that altered operational planning across multiple sectors. The balance of the armored war had not tipped. But it had unmistakably shifted. The battlefield fell silent, but the story of that lone Sherman did not end with the smoke clearing. For Mercer and his crew, the fight against 16 Panthers became the defining moment of their service, not because it made them famous, but because it proved that discipline and precision could bend even the harshest mathematics of war. In the weeks that followed, their tank did not become a showpiece or a symbol paraded for morale. It returned quietly to operations. There were more battles ahead, more long nights under camouflage nets, more hurried repairs made under blackout conditions. The crew fought again, not under the spotlight of legend, but under the same constant threat that consumed thousands of other tankers across the front. Reed's hands never lost their steadiness. Ortiz's endurance became a quiet benchmark for other loaders. Walsh continued to nurse the engine through terrain that punished every careless movement. Mercer remained the same calm voice inside the turret, never louder than necessary, never rushed. Recognition eventually came, but without ceremony. After-action citations noted exceptional fire discipline under overwhelming pressure and decisive engagement against numerically superior enemy armor. Medals were pinned. Hands were shaken. Then the war moved on. Across the Allied armored forces, the effects of that engagement spread farther than any of the crew could see at the time. Production of specialized Shermans increased. Training programs shifted emphasis toward long-range precision and ambush doctrine. Tank crews who once believed Panthers were untouchable from the front learned otherwise, carefully, cautiously, and always with respect for the danger involved. German forces adapted as well. Their own analysts distributed revised tactical guidance. Panthers began operating with heavier infantry screens. Engagement distances shifted. Ambush-counterambush became the new norm. The armored war did not become safer, only more complex. For Mercer and his men, the war eventually loosened its grip. Mercer survived through the remainder of the campaign. After the surrender, he returned to civilian life and worked once again with engines, this time in quiet shops instead of burning fields. Reed went home to metalwork, teaching younger apprentices the same patience that once governed his trigger finger. Ortiz carried the scars of exhaustion more than of wounds and built a family far from the sound of cannon. Walsh returned to open land and slow-moving seasons, where the only rumble under his feet came from tractors instead of tanks. None of them wrote memoirs. They did not seek to shape how history remembered their actions. To them, what happened in that shattered field was not legend. It was a day they survived when many did not. Today, only a handful of modified Shermans exist in museums and collections. Visitors walk past them in quiet halls, reading plaques that summarize the technology in a few lines of text. The machines rest spotless and cold, stripped of smoke and fear. Few who study them can fully imagine what it felt like inside one when the ground shook under advancing enemy armor. But the impact remains written into doctrine, into training, and into the silent confidence of crews who learned that even overwhelming force is not absolute. The engagement of 16 Panthers against one Sherman did not change the war by itself. It changed something just as important: belief. It reminded commanders that innovation does not always arrive with grand approval, and that sometimes the most decisive answers begin as quiet, contested ideas pushed forward by necessity rather than certainty. And it proved something simpler, and far more human. That on one day in 1943, under impossible odds, for men trusted their training, trusted each other, and stood their ground when every calculation suggested they should not. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that history is shaped not only by armies, but by individuals, then I ask you to do 3 simple things. Hit like so this story reaches others. Subscribe so more forgotten moments are not lost to time. And leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and whether someone in your family served. These stories survive because people choose to remember them. And today, you helped keep this one alive.